Today we'll look at how to get the most out of the Heart of the War. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we'll be doing our first in-depth tactics review of the Ork Codex and taking a good look at how best to use Ork Boyz on the tabletop. They're the core of almost every Ork list, and few troops can cause such a horrendous amount of carnage if they make it into close combat, so an absolutely pivotal unit for the Orks. In this video we'll be taking a look at their datasheet, any obvious rules, combos and synergies that we can see on the table, and my preferred way to run boys on the tabletop. In the background, Orks stand about 2 meters tall and they stand fully upright, though this is a rare occurrence, and in times of war they band together in unruly groups known as mobs. These are frequently led by an Ork nob or boss, who's bigger and meaner and more violent than all the others. Ork boy mobs form all sorts of different formations on the battlefield, depending on exactly what gear they are armed with, and what particular obsessions the Orks in that group fall prey to. Most commonly are the Slugger Boys, armed with heavy solid shot pistols known as sluggers, and brutal melee weapons known only as choppers. Protected by only a few scraps of flak jackets and maybe an armor plate bearing the mob's insignia, Orks like nothing better to throw themselves howling into the enemy lines, and even the most lowly Ork is still a brutal shock trooper by the standards of other races. Some Orks with a love for shooting and dagger tend to scavenge bigger guns, arming themselves with shooters rather than the slugger and chopper. Marksmanship isn't a skill that Orks are known for, however, preferring the loudest, noisiest guns to be fired in the general direction of the enemy army, and without exception, shooters double up as meaty close combat weapons to bash the enemy over the head with, should the fighting get up close and personal. There are many variants on the standard Ork mob, including stick bombers armed with crude hand grenade explosives, and Ard boys who have bothered to scavenge themselves a decent amount of scrap metal and armor plates. Regardless of their exact type, Orks tend to take to the field in enormous numbers, swarming the enemy positions with these violence-obsessed berserkers. All very nice, now let's see what they can do on the battlefield. So boys are a troop's choice for Codex Orks, and at base they come in a squad of 10 Orks, with one of them being able to be upgraded to a boss nob for free. They'll cost you 7 points each, so 70 points to field your basic mob of boys on the tabletop. They have a movement of 5 inches, weapon skill of 3+, ballistic skill 5+, strength and toughness 4, 1 wound, 2 attacks, leadership 6, and a 6-up save. Their profile is frankly interesting and a bit all over the place. High in toughness, low in armour, bad at shooting, but really good at hitting things with weapon skill 3+ and 2 attacks per basic trooper. The boss nob is a significant upgrade over a standard Ork boy, so it absolutely makes sense to include one in every single squad. His strength is 5, so is far better in close combat. He has 2 wounds and a whopping 3 attacks, and he'll help keep the boys in line a little bit more with leadership 7. At base, each model is armed with a slugger, chopper and stick bombs. The slugger has the exact same profile as a bolt pistol, a pistol 1 12-inch range strength 4 weapon with no AP and 1 damage. Your chopper is exactly the same as a chainsword, getting 1 additional attack with this weapon every time the model fights, meaning that your standard slugger boys are up to 3 attacks, and those stick bombs are exactly the same as Imperial frag grenades, a 6-inch range, grenade D6 weapon with strength 3, AP nothing and damage 1. Firstly, any Ork boy may replace his slugger and chopper with a shooter, and this doesn't cost you any extra. Shooters are 18-inch strength 4 weapons with assault 2, so basically give you slightly over double the firepower as they'll get longer range and more boys will be able to shoot. At the moment I honestly feel that shooter boys and slugger boys are quite well balanced. They both cost the same. The shooters essentially get 1 less very good attack in close combat, trading out for a much weaker attack at range, but having a bit more ranged firepower is really helpful in an Ork list, and if you are still charging in with a big mob of boys, there's a good chance that you might just be killing whatever you get into contact with anyway, so you might not necessarily need all those extra chopper attacks. For me, I could happily run a mob of all slugger and chopper boys, a mob of all shooter boys, or you can run a mob of half and half. In terms of maximising their competitive value, I suspect that this might be the best idea, as say if you're deep striking them with da jump or something, you could put the slugger boys up front and the shooter boys at the back, meaning that they might all be able to get to shoot, and then depending on the opponent whether you think you need more sluggers and choppers or more shooters, you can remove the ones that are less valuable to you in that game as casualties. In real terms though, this is going to create a bit of an organisational nightmare for your Orks, as when you're setting up and moving huge mobs of boys, you really don't want to be faffing around with every single one that's a slugger or a shooter, so for quality of life and not having to think about micromanaging every single last boy on the tabletop, it might well just be better to go one or the other. If we are taking multiple big mobs of them though, I think that there is certainly value in having some of them be shooter boys and some of them be slugger boys, as they can react to the different threats your opponent presents. Say if you needed a bit of ranged firepower on a unit that wouldn't be able to be charged this turn, you could counter that with some shooters, or if you just need absolutely every iota of close combat, you could counter it by throwing the slugger boys onto that threat. So I'm generally going to advocate that a mix is stronger, and you might be slightly swayed one way or the other depending on your using one of the clans that's better at shooting, or gives buffs for getting into close combat. The next option that the mob has is that for every 10 models in the unit, one Ork boy can take a tank buster bomb. Now you absolutely should do this if you want to optimise your unit, because they're free and they can be reasonably powerful when they're chucked at an enemy unit. Tank buster bombs are 6-inch grenade D3 shots with strength 8, AP-2 and a whopping damage D6, so if you can get them off then it's certainly not a bad idea at all. But to be honest, I wouldn't let this distract you from the main purpose of the boys squad. I wouldn't generally go manoeuvring them in a particularly weird way to try and get your tank buster shot off. Remember that despite the impressive profile, we're still firing at Ork ballistic skill of 5+, so for each tank buster bomb thrown, you're just as likely to do nothing as do anything. So certainly include them, mark the boys who have them, but don't worry too much if you don't wind up using them in each game. They're very much an extra nice to have, not generally a deal breaker for the Orks. Our next options are the Ork heavy weapons, the big shooter and the rocket launcher. You can pay to replace either the slugger and chopper or the shooter with them. A big shooter will cost you 5 additional points for an assault 3 36-inch range weapon with strength 5, and the rocket launcher will cost you 12 points for a 24-inch range assault 1 weapon with strength 8, AP-2 and damage 3. Now I'm a little bit on the fence with these two. On the one hand, if you are including them in a big bunch of Orks, they are likely to be very well protected, so could well be getting multiple turns of firepower out of them, meaning that they could be a good decision. On the other hand, for their cost, they really aren't the best firepower in the world point for point, and other areas in the Ork army generally do shooting better than boys mobs. 3 big shooters on 3 Ork boys in this unit will cost you 36 points for those 3 boys armed with the shooters, and for that you could have 5 Ork boys with regular shooters who will still be spitting out 10 shots at a lesser range, but will also be a lot harder to kill, and be far better in melee than the big shooters. So you are paying a bit of a steep premium for a few extra long-range strength 5 shots. The rockets are a touch more difficult to weigh up. They have some added value in an Ork range just because Orks just don't have all that much decent ranged anti-tank firepower. So including them in big mobs of boys can be one of the ways to help plug that gap, even if you are paying a bit of a premium for it. In particular, I think that rockets are very good with death skulls. Being able to reroll a hit and wound roll per unit is very powerful, and if you are running a rocket or 2 here, you're just going to get a ton more value out of it than most of the other clans, as they'll be more accurate when you can reroll a hit and wound roll per turn. Finally, the boss knob can replace its slugger and chopper with items from the nob's weapons list. In addition to retaining the options for the slugger and chopper, you can also take a big chopper, kill saw, power claw, power stabber, and up to one of the combi weapons, which is either a combi weapon with rocket launcher or a combi weapon with scorcher. Now this is really quite free and de-restricted. I think technically rules as written it means that you can take 2 choppers on the boss knob, should you really want to, meaning that this knob will be hitting at 5 strength 5 attacks in close combat, which is no slouch at all. It also means that if you are taking one of the bigger, more scary weapons, such as the big chopper, kill saw, power claw or power stabber, it's worth replacing your slugger rather than your chopper, as you can do this, meaning that you'll still get an extra attack with the chopper, in addition to these nasty claw attacks. The big chopper and power stabber are quite cheap options, the power stabber being strength user, AP-2 and damage 1, so for 3 points is a pretty decent upgrade to the knob's hitting power, particularly against elite targets. The big chopper is a bit of a mixed profile with strength +2, so strength 7, AP-1 and a flat damage 2, meaning that that's quite versatile against all targets, infantry, and will do some damage to vehicles as well. The power claw is a bit more of a jump with 13 points, strength ×2, so strength 10, AP-3 and damage D3, but you do subtract 1 from the hit roll, making it somewhat less reliable. And the kill saw is either 15 points or 23 points if you take a pair. Basically the same as the power claw, but AP-4 and flat damage 2, and you get to make 1 additional attack if they're armed with a pair. Again, I do think that these are fairly well balanced compared with each other. It just depends on how much you want to upgrade your knob's hitting power in close combat. Generally in a 30-man boys squad, I would take something to upgrade his power, though with 1 or 2 choppers he's certainly no slouch, just unupgraded. In particular, the power stabber for a bit of extra AP is great, particularly as he's already strength 5. The big chopper will also get you damage 2, as well as more strength and AP, so is pretty good all round and very good value for the 5 points, where the power claw turns him into actually a bit more of something that can tangle with tanks and true heavy armour. but you do pay a bit more of a premium for that. In general, I prefer to run either the big choppers or the power claws, but I can absolutely see the argument for other options too. In general though, if you do want to really optimise his loadout, his second weapon should really be a chopper, as getting that extra attack in close combat at strength 5 is so much better than getting a standard slugger attack. Now the Ork datasheet does have some special rules, including Here We Go for other standards, reroll any or all dices out of a charge roll, which makes them so more reliable to make close combat, particularly if they've come in by a deep strike either with teleporter or the jump. As all Orks, they have Daka to slightly soup up their shooting ability, with extra shots on every roll of a 6, and the roll of a 6 always succeeds, regardless of modifiers. And they also have Green Tide, which is an Ork Boyz specific one, which adds 1 to their attacks characteristic while it has 20 models or more in it. Now this last one is a really significant boost to their melee prowess. It means that your standard unupgraded Slugger Boy mob, if it makes contact with the enemy without taking casualties, which I know is unlikely, theoretically will be hitting home with 121 attacks. As they're hitting on 3s and a strength 4, it's going to do hefty damage to just about anything in the entire game. Never mind if you manage to get some more bonuses on them, either with psychic powers or clan traits or things that we'll talk about in a second. If you did somehow manage to pull off the unlikely feat of getting this many boys in close combat, that's an average of 6 dead Primaris Space Marines, or around about 30 dead Orks if you are fighting another clan. Even against your standard toughness 7 vehicle profile, that's an average of 8 wounds dealt to them, so even tanks aren't safe for a good kicking, never mind if you give them the knob something more fancy to try and force through a few more wounds. So overall, Ork Boyz are a fairly fragile, but very murderous unit in close combat, with a reasonable amount of mediocre shooting, and can be fielded in very large units to help maximise their chance to get into close combat. They're most certainly the core of the Ork list, so let's talk about a few other ways that we can get more out of them on the table. Let's talk about clan-specific options first then. As the core of the army, Ork Boyz find basically every clan pretty useful. Goths will give them a few extra attacks in close combat. By every time you roll a 6, you get an additional attack. It certainly amps up what they're best at, but in general they are pretty killy in close combat anyway, so it might be layering a slightly unnecessary buff on top of a buff. Evil Sons, I think, are possibly one of the most competitive choices for Ork Boyz, with their +1 to their move characteristic and +1 to advance and charge rolls. One of the main issues with Ork Boyz is that you need to get them into close combat absolutely as fast as possible, and as Orks can move, advance and charge with the aid of a war boss. This means that Evil Sons could add 3 inches to the distance that they could reach in close combat each turn, which frankly is a very significant amount, particularly when they're only moving 5 inches in the first place. Furthermore, Evil Sons are great for all the deep strike shenanigans Orks can do, specifically if you're either teleporting the boys, or if you're using da jump with a weird boy to throw them into the enemy's face. Making an 8-inch charge with the rerolls out of deep strike is far better than making a 9-inch one. Evil Sons are also great for shooter boys and any of the upgraded weapons that you've chosen in them, as they can advance and shoot these with no penalty. This is pretty nice and makes shooter boys more viable, as in general you're not going to want to hold back on an advance if it's going to make the difference between you making close combat, so you can both advance and still be kicking out a fair bit of Daka. Next we have Death Skulls, another one of my favourite clans for boys. Death Skulls gives you a 6+ invul save due to their lucky blue paint, which will just make your boys flatly tougher across the board, at least against anything with any AP whatsoever, and a lot of things do have decent AP, what with Space Marines and their AP bolters flying all over the place these days. In addition, as we already mentioned for the rockets, you can reroll a single hit roll, wound roll and damage roll for the unit with this culture each time it shoots or fights, so it's well worth including an individual rocket in each mob, and there's more value to putting a power claw on the knob as well, as you can use those rerolls for him. Next we have Bad Moons. Their armed to the teeth will give you reroll hit rolls of 1s for attacks made by models in the shooting phase. This certainly makes shooter boys and the Ork specific special weapons more viable again, as they'll just be that little bit more hard hitting than your standard mob. In addition, they can also have the option to shoot twice, and with a maxed squad of shooter boys, this could really help thin down some hordes if you're fighting some more on the table. Typically, a big mob of shooter boys shooting twice will get you around about 54 hits on the enemy, after you've taken Daka and the Bad Moons rerolls into account, so if you do need to make some hordes go away quickly, then this could be a decent choice. Next we have Blood Axes and their Tactics. These ones give you the benefit of cover even if they're not entirely on or in a terrain feature, but only provided the enemy unit is greater than 18 inches away from them. It's not an awful durability boost, but it can be negated with decent AP, and Orks generally want to be getting up fairly close and personal, so you might not actually get it against a lot of the enemy's guns a lot of the time. The second part of their tactic is pretty handy though, with being able to fall back and shoot or fall back and charge, meaning that once the blood axes do get into the enemy lines, they're going to be a bit of an unholy nightmare, being able to jump in and out of combat and tag which enemy units that they want to, though facing another round of Overwatch could be a little bit painful for Ork Boyz, who don't particularly enjoy that with their thin armor saves. Next we have the snake bites with their Da Old Ways. This basically gives you a 6+ ignore wounds shrug off, feel no pain type save. So again, it's a handy durability boost, though this one doesn't really help you much against anything that's multi-damage weapons, and you could certainly get the same benefits by bringing a pain boy along. Unfortunately, I just don't really think they're quite as strong as either Blood Axes or Death Skulls, who get a similar power durability boost and also get another fun and useful special rule. Snake bites just get the durability boost, and that can be easily replicated, so I wouldn't generally advocate them for the boys. Finally, we have freebooters and their competitive streak. They add 1 to their hit rolls for attacks made by models with this culture if any other friendly unit with this culture within 24 inches destroys an enemy unit that phase. This could be potentially useful for shooter boys, but in general freebooters tend to be more useful on the big backline orc shooter units, particularly as it can be a little bit hard to get this buff off, as you do need to be able to guarantee that you can kill something that shooting phase. I guess it could also be handy in melee as well, but it's just very hard to plan for this to routinely go off every time. It's certainly an interesting one, and one that would do better in someone who's got fairly high skill with the game to be able to try and orchestrate these scenarios. In summary though, they're good with basically any clan. For me, my favourite is Evil Sons, followed by Death Skulls, as I really like those rerolls. In addition to these culture options, we also have the options of the subcultures or specialist mobs from Saga of the Beast. There are a few interesting options from this, including Mad Boys, who give up their clan culture and associated benefits to roll a d3 at the start of each battle round, where they can either get +1 to armor save, auto passing morale, or +1 strength, and I would generally re-roll the auto mass morale one, as usually orcs are going to be fine with this provided they have decent numbers. I don't think I actually mentioned it earlier, but as we know, Ork Boyz can substitute their leadership for the number of models in their squad, or another squad within 6 inches, meaning that provided you have a few 30-man squads around, they're likely to be remaining at leadership 30 and pretty much immune to morale. +1 armor save for a 5+ save for a turn, or a +1 strength for when they get into combat are both decent buffs, but I do find that they could be a bit problematic and you might not get the one that you want when you want it. It could certainly be a fun way to play an Ork Boyz army though. The other relevant options are the Boom Boys, who have Blow It Up. This one increases the strength and AP of rockets, stick bombs and tank buster bombs for the Ork Boys, so certainly make rockets more viable here. And if you did manage to get a big mob of boys up close and personal and use the extra stick bomb stratagem, you could have a lot of stick bombs and tank buster bombs with very scary AP flying at the enemy. I wouldn't say boys are optimal for this one though, just because you lack any other upgrades for the majority of the mob. It's just for the specialists that get anything from this. Finally, there's the option of Feral Orcs, which have a 6-inch pile-in, and they roll 3 and pick the highest 4 advanced rolls. For me, unfortunately, this one just doesn't compare with Evil Sons, who just have a flatly better mobility buff in my opinion. Extra pile-ins are certainly nice, but I'd rather have the extra chance of making close combat in the first place, thank you very much. In terms of character buffs, the boys again can make use of most of the options in the Ork army. War bosses are really useful to have around for the Ork Boys, as they give you advance and charge, which far ups the chance of you actually making it into close combat, as they aren't getting very far very fast with only a 5-inch move. They can also break some heads if the mob gets a bit unruly and wants to run away, and they're not within a 30-man boy squad radius, where you take D3 casualties on the unit to basically auto-pass morale. Big mechs with custom force fields are one of the best ways to keep your boys safe from the first turn or two's worth of fire. You do have to bunch up just a little bit to be within the big mech's aura, as it has to be the entire squad that's within 9 inches of his base. This is still possible with multiple 30 Ork boy squads though, and particularly if you're going second and can't hide all the boys out of line of sight, then this will genuinely save you a lot of casualties going into the game. Another thing that you can add to this defensive castle is of course the Pain Boy. Now he needs to be within 3 inches of the boys to have his 6+ Feel No Pain aura take effect, but with absolutely massive squads this is usually very easy to achieve. You just need to chain back a model or two to be within range of him, and keep the squad with a decent chance of ignoring wounds. Finally, Weird Boys can really soup up boys in a couple of ways. Their best power for the Ork Boys being Da Jump, which is the one where you take up an Ork Boy squad that's on the table and deploy it again as per the Deep Strike rules, meaning that you can set up within 9 inches of your opponent and have a chance to get a charge that turn. This one is basically mandatory in an army going heavy on Ork Boys, as it really keeps up the pressure on your opponent right from turn 1. there's nothing like a whole load of orcs appearing from nowhere and charging up to tie up the battle line and murder a bunch of infantry. If you have multiple or have a warp head around, then you can also use the Warpath psychic power, which gives you +1 attack to the Ork Boyz mob, meaning that if you have your standard Slugger Boy mob, you now have a theoretical maximum of 152 attacks. These 4 characters are the ones that I'd most consider when running an army mainly focused around a horde of Ork Boyz. They all provide incredibly useful buffs to the army and help fill out the HQ choices for those battalions that you're sure to be having by having all of these troops about. There are a few other options worth considering though, not least the new Ghazghkull. He's particularly strong with Goth Ork Boyz, giving them the usual war boss buffs, also an extra +1 attack in close combat, and allowing them to reroll 1s in close combat too. He could certainly form the heart of a battle line, and your opponent's not even going to be able to shoot him down even though they can directly target him due to that no more than 4 wounds in a phased rule. You do also have the option of a Nob with a War banner, who can have your nearby orcs add +1 to their hit rolls in the fight phase, which is certainly a respectable buff to their melee damage output, but to be honest for me he's just a little bit pricey at 75 points, and I wouldn't typically tend to include him before I've included Weird Boys, Big Mechs, Pain Boys and War Bosses. Orcs can also get transport vehicles in the truck and the battle wagon, although I think for the most part it's usually going to be best to just green tide it across the board. Orc trucks aren't overwhelmingly great for the cost at the moment, and having a small squad of boys is quite a lot less efficient as they become vulnerable to morale, and you might take serious casualties in Overwatch that mean that they don't really get to do all that much when they're in close combat anyway. I'm a little bit more of a fan of the battle wagons, as they can still contain a decent sized mob within them, and they're a lot harder for your opponent to remove without investing some decent firepower. Particularly with that new Fortress custom job that you can get in the new Saga of the Beast book. It means that you could have a very hard shell for your boys to get across the battlefield in, before hopefully jumping out in ideal charge range and breaking some heads. I'm sure we'll get a chance to look into the truck and battle wagon in later videos. Let's look at stratagems next, and the orcs have some really good ones for boys. Firstly, we have Mob Up. This can be used if you have 2 orc mobs, where one is 10 models or less, and the other is 10 or more, and the 2 units merge, and for the rest of the battle they're accounted as a single unit for all rules purposes. Now this one has a lot of shenanigans that you can play with it. Some people like to build it into their list, where they basically take one small mob of 10 boys next to a 30-man squad, spend 1 command point to mob them up, and then use their jump to fling the combined 40-boy squad into the enemy lines for a ludicrous amount of orc attacks hitting home right from the get-go. If you cast Warpath on that same unit, then theoretically that big unit of Ork Boys armed with sluggers and choppers would have around about 200 attacks, and you'd also have the benefit of having 2 knobs in the squad for even more hitting power. You can also use this to deny kill points to the enemy by salvaging a small depleted boy squad and combining it into the greater whole of another one next door to it. And you could potentially mob up a squad into close combat. Say if one of the squads is in close combat and the other one isn't, then that could be a very good way to quickly get them there without them having to charge or anything. It's certainly a very useful stratagem, this one. Next we have extra stick bombs, which is again 1 command point. This is the one where you can throw 10 grenade weapons for 1 CP rather than 1 in a unit. It's particularly relevant in Ork Boy squads, as in a 30-man unit you could have 3 tank buster grenades in there, and this one could be very good if you combine it with that Boom Boys specialist mob that we were talking about, as those stick bombs will just hit that little bit harder. In normal circumstances I don't think it's enormously worth it. It could be good for a few more wounds on a vehicle. My math says that you get around about an extra 2 or 3 wounds on a vehicle, compared with just throwing the one of the things that you would have been able to do anyway. Next we have Grot Shields, which is a very useful one to the Orc army as a whole, where if you have a Gretchen unit in front of the Orc mob, you pay a CP and you can make the hits hit the Gretchen rather than hit the Orc mobs. Could be very good indeed for keeping a frontline boy squads alive, particularly turn 1, meaning that your opponent will have to remove a big unit of Gretchen before they actually get to the boys that they really want to shoot instead. A good way to waste a lot of enemy firepower on Grots rather than on boys. Next we have Loot It, which you can use when an Orc infantry unit is nearby a destroyed vehicle, whether it's a friend or foe, and you can also use it if you were in a truck or battle wagon and your ride was destroyed. Basically for 1 command point, your Orcs gain 1 pip of armor save, so they'll be having a 5-up save for the rest of the game. It's not a crazy powerful defensive upgrade, but could be handy in a pinch, and more so if it affects a big 30-boy unit and your opponent doesn't have that many high AP weapons. Next we have one of the most powerful for the Ork Boys, which is the Unstoppable Green Tide. You use this whenever an Ork mob has less than half its starting numbers, and you pay 3 command points to remove it from the battlefield, and then you set it up again wholly within 6 inches of the edge of the battlefield and more than 9 inches from enemy models, and you can set it up at its full strength starting capacity. So this is a way to get somewhere between 16 and 29 Orks back for the cost of just 3 command points. It is a really powerful one, this one, and as well as the extra Orks that you get back, being able to put them right up close and personal to the enemy for a charge is another very scary threat and can be a good way of getting your boys to the front line as well as replenishing them. Note that you do this at the end of your movement phase, so provided your opponent either wipes the squad or doesn't quite kill half of them, then you're not actually going to be able to do this, but it does really mess with your opponent's shooting priorities, making it kind of essential they do wipe out full squads, so even by its mere existence, it will hamper a smart opponent. This one is a very good pickup if you can get to use it throughout the game on a big 30 boy squad. Next we have Get Stuck In Lads for 3 command points. You use this stratagem at the end of the fight phase and select an Ork infantry unit that has already fought in the fight phase, and you can now fight with it a second time. We've already talked about just how many attacks Ork Boys can get, and this is a way to kind of double down on the amount that you get. The only issue is that you are likely to be fighting with a few less the second time, as virtually anything that you're in close combat with and hasn't died to your first flurry of attacks is likely to be fairly big and strong and will probably have killed some Ork Boys in return. In any case though, fighting again is really handy. As well as all the extra damage that you also get the Consolidate and Pile In moves that it also grants you, and this could even potentially be worth it just to lock up a whole load of enemy tanks that you couldn't quite reach with the one fight activation. We also have more Daka, which can allow Daka to proxy on a 5 or a 6 rather than just a 6, which can be handy for your shooter boys, particularly if they're trying to take out something with a negative modifier to hit, such as some sneaky Eldar Rangers or something. It's a bit expensive at 2 command points, but it will keep them firing at a decent amount, and you'll get more extra hits because you get them on 5s rather than 6s as well. Next up we have Ork Boyz, which is 2 command points. This one basically allows you to get a 5+ save for a boys unit to give them some extra scrap metal to cover themselves before the game. I honestly wish that this one was 1 command point rather than 2 CP. At 2 CP I don't really think it's all that worth it, as going from a 6 up to a 5+ save is nice, but it's also not exactly spectacular. If you did want to equip your entire army as Ork Boys, it would certainly be helpful, but you'd be paying absolutely through the nose in command points, seeing as we've got so many other decent command point options on the board for the Ork Boys, including things like Fighting Again and Endless Green Tide. I don't think that Ork Boys massively competes incredibly well. Though if you do have a big upgraded unit that you're really making the linchpin of your strategy, spending 2 command points to keep it alive just that bit longer might not be the worst thing in the world. Finally, for the main stratagems, we have Teleporter, which yet again is another awesome option for boys mobs. This is the one that allows you to put them in deep strike reserves before the game for 2 command points, and come down in the normal way either turn 2 or turn 3, 9 inches from your opponent. Absolutely great from Evil Sons with their boosted charges out of deep strike. This is another way of getting Ork boy mobs straight to the front line, provided you wait for a turn off the battlefield. I wouldn't do this with literally every boy mob, as it is somewhat CP intensive, and it is possible to screen out Ork Boys with chaff units and things, meaning that they might not be dropping anywhere close to the core of the enemy army, but having a big mob or 2 in the teleporter I think is generally a good idea for an Ork army. Finally, I just wanted to mention the Goth stratagem, which are Scar Boys. This one's a 1 command point upgrade for a Goth Boys unit that also can't be Ork Boys as per the other stratagem, and you increase their strength from strength 4 to strength 5. Now, getting to strength 5 is a pretty decent upgrade, as it means that you're wounding Space Marines on 3s and things like Knights or Leman Russ tanks on 5s. This one's certainly worth a consideration in a Goth's Ork army, but again remember, if you are using it on multiple boys, it's going to get very expensive. You might be better off expending the command points to try and find ways to get them to close combat, rather than making them stronger when they are, as of course you don't deal any damage at all if you don't get them into close combat in the first place. So let's talk a little bit about how I actually like to run boys on the battlefield. As we've mentioned a couple of times, I generally prefer them in 30 boy units starting on the board, and I'm happy to mix sluggers and shooters, and generally give the boss knob some sort of close combat upgrade. In general, I really do prefer Evil Sons as the choice of clan, just because you will really want every single chance to get the boys into close combat, as that's where they do all of their efficient damage. In general, in my Ork list at the moment, I'll typically start 3 30-boy squads on the board, centered around a custom force field mech, and all within range of a pain boy and a war boss, with a weird boy nearby for jumping some of them. In general, the front of this formation wants to be towards the enemy lines, so turn 1 they can start charging forwards and dominating the board. I'd also have at least one 30-boy squad in the teleporter reserve to jump down turn 2 and hopefully get stuck into close combat right out of nowhere. When you're moving forward, I'd absolutely think about advancing into the midfield, blazing away with any guns that you've got, and jumping one of the squads to try and get a first turn charge, ideally after also loading up that same unit with extra attacks from Warpath. If there's nothing to charge, I'd ideally look to keep all units within the custom force field range, which can be a bit tricky to do when you're moving large numbers of models and you don't know exactly how far they'll be advancing. If your opponent has foolishly moved forward into the midfield, I'd certainly think about going for a first turn charge after advancing because of the war boss and getting stuck into the enemy. If you're going second, I'd think about what sort of guns the enemy has and how efficiently they're going to be able to remove your orcs. You might be able to hide or blunt some of the enemy firepower by hiding some of them out of line of sight. Bottom floor ruins are most certainly your friend here, and for any that are in sight, you could think about setting up a grot mob just in front of them and using that grot shield stratagem to force the opponent to go through an entire mob of grots before they even get to the dangerous boys. From there, it's really going to depend on the army that you're facing and the objective game that you're playing. Having big, durable units of boys that can jump around the board and potentially tie up units and score objectives very easily can be really powerful for the objective game, and you can quite easily take over the midfield with boys, at least for the first few turns, as the enemy will generally want to be staying away from them unless they want to get hit very hard over the head with choppers. For any shooter boys or any other firepower that you have in your army, I'd often tend to focus it on the units that aren't right on the front line, as the ones on the front line you can usually get stuck into with your close combat gear. When you are charging, you really do need to think about Overwatch. Ork Boys really can suffer a lot from a powerful Overwatch unit, particularly something like Space Marines, and for them you also need to really look out for things like Auspex scan from having a big unit of scary bolter wielding dudes from deleting an entire unit of boys as they come down from reserve. Basically, each charge you need to make the decision as to what sort of units they can get into or reliably kill. There can be quite a fine line between not being adventurous enough or not trying to tie up enough units and spreading yourself a bit thin so you engage multiple units and actually start to take decent casualties back in return just from the incidental units that you happen to have engaged, as even most gunline elements will manage to punch dead an orc boy or two each turn that they're in close combat. The age-old trick in 8th edition of taking a hostage and wrapping and trapping units is certainly something that Ork Boys want to try and exploit if they can. If you've got a well-screened enemy gun line, then charging one unit of chaff and then consolidating in to wrap and trap the second unit of chaff could be a great way to keep your boys safe until future turns. Certainly, if you've got any opportunity to, then Endless Green Tide is usually a pretty go-to stratagem. I'd only be hesitant if your Ork Boys that are depleted are incredibly well positioned to make some critical damage to the enemy army. In that case, it might be a bit more of a decision as to whether or not you just leave them there to do that key damage. Certainly remember, get stuck in lads as well for the fight again, as well as just the extra damage that you can provide. This could be really key for, say, finishing off a chaff infantry unit that hasn't quite died, and freeing up your big mob of boys to go and charge something new and juicy in your turn. In general, Ork Boys, provided they get into close combat, should be able to cause a decent amount of carnage in the enemy army, and hopefully at least dominate the centre of the board for several turns, and with a bit of luck put you decently ahead on objectives. Now there are some alternatives that you can consider. Storm Boys are a pretty decent analogy to Ork Boys. They're 9 points rather than 7, and for 9 points you get that fancy rocket pack, allowing them both to move very fast indeed, and also charge flyers and things. I'd certainly consider a squad of these if you were thinking about taking a squad of boys in the teleporter, just because you'll save those command points, and also having their massive mobility once they are down on the board is really handy for later turns, if your opponent doesn't manage to deal with them. They do lose the mob rule of getting extra attacks when they have 20 or more models though, so they won't hit quite as hard as regular Ork Boys when you're comparing one 30-man squad to another. So overall, Ork Boys are a very solid all-round troops choice. The vast majority of competitive Ork lists run a few big mobs of them, which is particularly good to see as I do enjoy the Green Tide tactic myself. I'm sure there'll be things that I've missed despite this video going on quite a while, as there really are just so many combos and synergies throughout the Ork army with their core troops, so if you've got any insights then let us know down in the comments below. I will of course be continuing to make Ork videos over the next few weeks, so consider subscribing to Auspex Tactics or checking back later if you'd like to see more. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page down in the description below. The Patrons are what allow me to keep on focusing on these videos and making more and better content as we go on, and I'm very grateful to all of you guys who are supporting. There are a few fun benefits for being a member of the Patreon, including seeing early videos, prize draws and voting on future videos, so if any of that interests you or you just want to support the channel, then the link's down in the description. In any case, a very big thank you for watching, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.